Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for making time to join us today at this webinar where we're going to be giving children and young people from all around the world the opportunity to share their reflections on the war in Ukraine. I want to begin just by pausing to reflect for a moment on everything that's been going on in Ukraine since 2014 and long before that, but especially since the 24th of February this year when Russia launched a full-scale invasion. Tragically, thousands of lives have been lost, millions of people have been displaced, and the current situation is as worrying as it ever has been, not only in the east of the country, but in other places where shelling has resumed. And our thoughts are obviously with everyone who's been affected in whatever way, and we do extend a particularly warm welcome to everyone who's attending this webinar from Ukraine itself. You haven't come to hear from me, so I will whiz through some introductions very quickly before inviting our young people to speak. Before I do, I just want to explain how this webinar came about. So back in 2014, Lady Lucy French founded Never Such Innocence, a very wonderful organisation that gives young people a voice on conflict. And they run an annual competition inviting people aged 9 to 18 from all around the world to submit artwork, poetry, speeches and songs which reflect their views on conflict and its aftermath. Unsurprisingly, this year, lots of young people submitted work that reflects on the war in Ukraine, and Lucy really wanted their powerful, compassionate, inspiring voices to be more widely heard. So she and I got talking. I run a research project at the University of St Andrews, which looks at long-established and evolving habits of visualising war and peace. Together with Never Such Innocence and some other wonderful people on this call, I'm developing a strand of work to look specifically at the forces that shape young people's views on conflict. And we're particularly interested in the impact which young people's voices can have in shaping adults' habits of viewing and understanding, mitigating and preventing conflict, and also in building peace. So one aim of today's webinar is simply to bring some young people from different parts of the world into dialogue with each other. But another aim is to give them the chance to share how they feel about the war in Ukraine with a range of policymakers, educators, researchers, military personnel and members of the public. And we would ask all adult attendees to think as they listen about the value of involving children in conversations on conflict and what adults can do going forward to make more space for children's voices and to recognise their very unique kinds of expertise. We have 4 adult panellists joining us today who are going to respond to what our young people share with us. In alphabetical order, we've got Professor Beier, whose research looks at how young people are socialised into particular ways of thinking about war, and also at how children and childhood are treated in political contexts. Dr. Helen Berents her research advocates for the wider involvement of children and young people in peace-building processes. We've also got with us Lieutenant General Tom Copinger-Symes, CBE, a soldier with extensive combat experience who's now Deputy Commander of UK Strategic Command. And finally, we've got Sean Loughna, a research consultant at the International Organisation for Migration, specialising on displacement in Ukraine and the wider region. So many thanks to Marshall, Helen, Tom and Sean for being with us today. And thank you above all to our young panellists, who I will introduce in turn as we hear from them. In a couple of moments, I am going to invite 3 young people from Ukraine to speak first. But before that, I'm going to ask Will Dazil from Never Such Innocence to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Alice. I will indeed. My name is Artem. I'm 10 years old. I live in the city of Zhvati Vadi, in the central part of Ukraine. I love my city very much because I was born and live here. I love Ukraine very much because I am Ukrainian. I also love to draw and live, just live. Of the 10 years I have lived, 8 years in my country, there is a war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. Many Ukrainians died in this war, including children. With my paintings, I want to convey to all people that the most precious thing they have is life, and that peace must be preserved on the entire planet Earth. Thank you for choosing my work and helping my dream come true.
Thank you very much, Will. And those are just Artem's words there. And I think his words capture what this webinar is really all about. Children have very powerful voices and ways of expressing themselves. and they really want adults around them to listen. And I think it's worth noting that Artem sent the first picture in on the left-hand side in March, when I suspect he felt a little bit more hope for the future. And the second picture he sent in a couple of months later as events in Ukraine have developed. So what we're going to do now is turn to our first live speaker, Yana from Ukraine, and ask her to read a speech that she submitted to Never Such Innocence back in April. Yana, over to you.
Hello, everyone. We are from Ukraine. Year 2022, progress is moving relentlessly, and Ukraine there's a war. Unfortunately, there are countries in the world for which the rules of coexistence haven't changed since the Middle Ages. Grab, destroy, impose and swell. Unfortunately, neighbors are not chosen, and Ukraine is struggling, bleeding, losing lives, losing whole towns and villages. The herd that divided my country on the February 24 brings death and destruction. You didn't see Ukraine this spring. There's no one in the whole world so beautiful, colorful, sweeter. But for us, the calendar stopped at the mark of February 24. Our class is friendly, cheerful, they love to travel, dream, make plans for the future. What a terrible word war. And it's not a nursery movie, the worst thing that could have happened. We finished the 8th grade remotely. Rocket fires and air raids continue with varying intensity. We interrupt lessons, go down to the walls. 72 were allowed to resist Ukraine, but the Ukrainian people didn't believe the conclusion of analysts. We are fighting, we are liberating our lands. In the first day of the war, we were alone against Russian invaders, but thanks God the world hasn't left Ukraine. Great Britain, Poland, the Baltic countries, the USA, and many other countries came to the aid of our country. Weapons were provided, refugees were received, and sanctions were imposed. The whole country rose. Those who can't hold a weapon in their hands go to volunteers, help the wounded, become donors. And what about me? I tried to get as many people as possible to know about the tragedy in Ukraine. I'm very grateful for the platform provided to me by the organizers of Never Such Innocence competition. My family and I didn't evacuate. Of course, I'm frail like anyone else. I'm just trying to work so that there's no time for fear. A few months later, the war is still a war, but there's no hope that will end soon. Now I'm in the physics classroom. On the wall of it is Sun 225 Maria is depicted, making its way through the wall. Russia has destroyed our Maria, but the dream of Ukraine free from the occupier cannot be destroyed. We will fight for our land and home to a victorious end. And after the victory, do you hear me? A new Maria will be built by all means. It was the world's largest An-225 Maria aircraft. Russia may have destroyed our plane, but they will never be able to destroy our dream of a strong, free and democratic European state. We will win. Thank you.
Thank you, Yana. And I should say that we're going to share the video which Yana recorded of that speech with everyone after the event. And the text on your screen is some extra material which Yana sent into Never Such Innocence, reflecting on the long history of conflict in the region and why the lessons of history haven't perhaps been learnt. Thank you very much, Yana. We'll have some responses to that in a minute. But next, I'm going to invite Anastasia, also from Ukraine, just to say a few words about the painting which she has put together and which she submitted to Never Such Innocence, called Back to School. Anastasia, over to you.
Yes, thank you. The war of the Russian Federation against the Ukraine didn't even leave the possibility of school education for children. After seeing what happened to my school, I decided for myself that my best reaction would be to depict it in art. I was inspired to create a picture with a group of teenagers who, after a long time, returned to their school, having created a peaceful atmosphere for themselves by playing a guitar. They continue to be among the ruins of a familiar place. Anyway, they calmly continue to sit in their classroom, silently recalling moments from a past life spent at the school.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. And it's a really wonderful picture that shows a past as well as a present. We'll come back to this, I'm sure, when we hear from our adult panelists. But I want also just to invite Sasha to speak a few words himself. Again, from Ukraine, Sasha sent in a speech to Never Such Innocence called 300 Spartans. And Sasha, I think you're not going to read that out, but actually read a more recent speech that you've written. Is that right?
Hi there, we are from Ukraine. Today, I want to tell you about Ukrainians. In my project, I talk about courageous defenders of Donetsk airport, comparing them to 300 Spartans. At the time I was working on my project, there was relative peace in Ukraine. Yes, Crimea and Donbass were occupied, but cities and villages were not shelled. Everything changed on February 24. Hundreds of tons of deadly metal were poured on the heads of Ukrainians. Hundreds of children have died from the shelling, were orphaned, raped and maimed. Thousands of peaceful, innocent Ukrainians have realized their reality. Life is death, peace is war. We all lived our lives, making plans for the future. But now, all Ukrainians have only one dream left. This is a victory. We were given 72 hours to surrender, but enemy was wrong. At the beginning of the war, we had much less military equipment. But we had one main thing, Ukrainian people, the main pride and value of Ukraine. For hundreds of years, Ukraine has been fighting for its independence, from the times of Kievan Rus, Cossack era, and now. And not weapon and numerical superiority, but courage and resilience of human character, strength of spirit and devotion to the fatherland is the main driving force in the war with Russian aggressor. Each war has its own legends, unconquered defenders of Mariupol, the night ghost of Kyiv, the Bayraktar operators and defenders of Snake Island, and we can list hundreds of heroes who defended our state. But victory is not only on battlefield. Hundreds of people have become donors, saving lives of the wounded, and doctors, teachers, firefighters, farmers, everybody in his place make every effort to win. Of course, one patriotism cannot defeat the enemy, and thank God, Ukraine has such friends as Great Britain and Poland, Baltic states and Czech Republic, the United States and Canada, Slovakia and Australia. The whole civilized world came to the defense of our state, providing weapons and teaching our military to use them, receiving refugees and providing humanitarian aid. Ukraine will win this war because Ukrainians have risen to the people's war for their land, and truth is on our side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And again, we will share Sasha's speech, a recording of it with everyone after the event. So we've heard there from 3 young Ukrainians speaking with internet connections that are being disrupted by shelling, all sorts of disruption to schooling and so on, as this painting powerfully shows. And I want to invite now our adult panelists to respond to what they've just heard. So, Helen, if it's okay, I'd quite like to start with you and just hear your reflections on how these 2 speeches and this piece of art have struck you. What do you take away from them, or what reflections do you want to share?
Thank you so much, Alice, and thank you to all the presenters who have just spoken. It's a real privilege to get to share this space with you and to hear your stories and see your work. One of the things that I was really thinking about when I was listening to you all and looking at the wonderful art that's been created is thinking about the challenges of time that war can pose, and you all talk about in different ways across your conversations, thinking about the survival of the present moment and the challenges that you're all facing and your families and the idea of your nation as a whole, but also thinking about what a future might look like and the challenges of trying to imagine the future when you're trying to survive in a present. And also really struck by memories of the past, whether that be of school and the peaceful familiar space, or whether that is the history of the place you are from, and what it means to carry that forward when you're in the midst of this. And so I was just thinking about how in all these different registers and in all these different ways, when you're speaking, I'm really thinking about how much meaning there is in the stories that you are telling and the experiences that you are sharing, to think about the both immediate and the broader effects of conflict that you're all living through and surviving at present.
Thanks, Helen. And that issue of time is really interesting. Both Jana and Sasha, and indeed Artem, have updated their reflections and wanted to share things as the war has progressed. And Anastasia's picture there shows this past and present all in one space. And yeah, absolutely, this living through this dislocation of time is something that you're all experiencing. Tom, General Tom, I wonder if we can come to you next and just hear your reflections on the artwork that you've seen and the speeches that you've heard.
Thank you, Alice, and thanks for the opportunity to join today, and thanks to our three contributors so far for their work. So time's been mentioned already. I suppose what's going through my head is that sense of dislocation of time and reality, and how over time reality shifts in some fundamental ways. A couple, I think, both Jana spoke about this idea of no time for fear, and then spoke about the dream of a strong, free, democratic Ukraine. And then I think it was Sasha or Alexander who then picked up that idea of dreamlike, the sense of a dream and your connection with reality and conflict that they're so powerfully expressing is your questioning of, is this the reality, or was the reality of what came before? And you can see in Anastasia's picture there, that juxtaposition of, before and after, of dream and reality, of nightmare and reality, and you step, I think, in conflict either side of that divide, and you're never quite sure which is the reality and which is the dream, which is the nightmare, and which is the reality. So all of that comes out very strongly to me, and as you alluded to, this continuity and change. So again, in the picture we're looking at that now, this strong sense that the continuity of the human spirit, and several people have used that word spirit and will, and that continuity that comes with the eternal, including art, of course. And it's no surprise that there's a picture there, but there's also a guitar in there, and those things we go back to retain our connection with the old world are often artistic things that take us away from the current reality, back or forward to either a fixed point or to a future dream. So I think those are the things that strike me. And then I just wanted to bring out Sasha's comment about each war has its own legends. Each war creates its own legends, but they're not just on the battlefield. And that sort of struck me as very, very powerful in the context today. So sorry, a bit rambling, but I mean hugely powerful images and words. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And I just want to circle back actually to Artem's pictures, where I think we can see that earlier picture with that sort of dream alongside reality, and then as time has moved on, actually a sort of even harsher reality as these cities, Mariupol and Bucha and so on, have suffered so much. Thank you, and it's interesting that you picked out the guitar in Anastasia's picture, because we've got another painting coming up which really is about music and that place that we go to sometimes in the midst of conflict. Marshall, can I bring you in here and just hear from you, your reflections on what we've seen?
Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you to everyone for your contributions and comments so far. I'm really struck by this idea of time, right, and being in time, and also doing, and how what you do in the world changes with the changes in everyday life under conflict across time, but also across space, because we'll be hearing from others in places far from the conflict zone. When I was looking at the slides this week, taking in your artwork and thinking about reading the words and thinking about the things that you have to say, I'm struck by how perfectly you all show how young people have important things to tell us in moments in time, right? How your words and images are, in fact, important participation in global politics and in the demands for peace across time. And so I've been sitting here taking notes. Some of you might have noticed as I've listened today, because you're helping me to think about all of this. And that's important because it means that I'm recognizing you as the authorities on the things that you're expressing. I mean, after all, like, these are your perspectives, and those perspectives matter because they have the potential not only to reach, but to influence others. And what I guess I want to say then is that you are, through this, important actors in global politics in what you're doing. And adults don't need to challenge you to become that, because that is what you are already. The challenge and the responsibility is ours, adults, to listen and to take you seriously as authorities on what you're sharing, because that comes out of your experience of things happening in our world. So thank you for demonstrating so effectively why we need to accept that challenge, we adults, and that responsibility, and also for giving me so much to think about already. I look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Thank you, Marshall. And you're absolutely right. And I was struck in both Jana and Sasha's speeches at the combination of reflections on what's been going on, but also real critical analysis of what the UN might or might not have been doing. For example, at one point in Jana's speech, Jana said, "You don't know what Ukraine has been like in the spring, but I can tell you." And it's those unique perspectives and that desire to communicate what you know in your place and time that makes a huge difference. So thank you, Sean. Just coming to you, it would be interesting to have your response to what we've heard and what we've seen.
And thanks to my fellow panelists, and particularly to the young people who've made these wonderful presentations, which are extremely striking and quite moving, actually. And I suppose as an employee of the United Nations, I feel I should kind of address some of the very, very important points that some of you make. I'm here in a personal capacity, not an official one as a representative of the United Nations, but I can't help but be struck by the issues you raise being really central questions in the world today about where the United Nations is going, what they've been doing, and their role in the future. And you quite rightly point to, I think I would say, missed opportunities in the past. You talk about the context of the Second World War and the hope that the United Nations represented in bringing war to an end and so on. And then 2014, of course, conflict in Ukraine began again. And I found it very interesting, the reference to the cyborgs and the bravery of Ukrainians back in 2014. That was, I remember this well. It's when I began working. I was in Ukraine at the time. And so I suppose what that brings me, where that leads me to thinking is what more can the United Nations be doing, and what kind of future do we expect for the United Nations? Because at the moment we are, and this is a discussion that is being held within the UN system, which is, complex and convoluted, because you have the Security Council, but you have the permanent members and so on and so forth. So it's a very large group of organizations, really, rather than a single one. But it does really beg the question of what more we can be doing and what kind of future we need to be working towards. And I obviously don't have any answers on this, but I was just very struck by some of your comments and depictions of where we're at the moment, and in these what are very worrying times, I think. So again, it's this reflection, I suppose, on time, and as we move forward, and I think about missed opportunities, and then how we might move forward on that. So really, it's a question more than anything else. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sean. And yeah, young people, as Marshall said, identifying these missed opportunities. The UN itself has a youth, peace and security agenda, which Helen is very expert on. We might hear a bit more about that later, perhaps. But the UN is explicitly interested in involving young people more and more in solving the problems around conflict and thinking about how conflict's aftermath is dealt with. So this is a very pertinent time to have these voices coming through very strongly from everyone here. So I want, first of all, just to thank all of the speakers so far, speaking from Ukraine, from your experiences and perspectives of the last few months, but also the last 8 years and more. Thank you very much for sharing your views with us. I just want to mention to attendees that there is a Q&A function, and you can, if you have any responses, reflections or questions, you're very welcome to pop them in the Q&A, and we'll get round to some time permitting towards the end. But it's time now to move on to 3 more young people. And first up is Olivia from South Korea. Now, I'm not sure if Olivia has managed to make it to the call. Will, if not, would you be able to just introduce Olivia's art?
Absolutely. Yeah, Olivia, I do not believe is here. But yes, I have a description that goes alongside her piece. Threats of a major war seem surreal. But this is reality, the reality of a life after a conflict. Past conflicts have long-lasting effects, and neglected, the baobab continues to grow. And that is what happened. It has grown to consume us. We cannot forget that just because one conflict has ended, it does not mean that another cannot happen. We cannot pretend that we are after conflict. I wanted to tell the world that we must actively work on prevention, but that is just one of the things I needed to say, as this conflict has been characterised not only by devastation, but also by fierce retaliation, not just soldiers and governments, but by the common people. The bravery of the Ukrainian people has been almost unbelievable, inspiring protests all around the world, including in Russia. The people fight with Molotov cocktails, entirely useless against tanks and machine gun fire. It represents the people's bravery to fight for peace. That is what I wanted to depict in this piece. The fire of retaliation that these people embodied will burn brighter and longer the more Putin tries, because these acts are merely a fuel for their courage.
Thanks very much, Will. And it's a very powerful picture, which you will have seen on the advertising for this webinar, Molotov Cocktail for Peace, really getting to the heart, actually, of an extraordinary paradox of some forms of peacemaking, which is that sometimes it does involve fight and resilience. And I'm really struck that Olivia from South Korea has seen exactly what Sasha was asking us to see in his speech, that resilience, that bravery, of the Ukrainian people. So that's Olivia's piece. And now I'm going to invite Angelina from Russia to read a poem or a speech that she has written called Scars. Angelina, are you able to share that with us?
Yeah, sure. As you said, hi everyone, I'm Angelina. I am 18 and I currently live in Russia. But the thing is that I am from Russian-Ukrainian family, and my relatives are from these both countries. So I currently have my relatives and friends who live in Ukraine, and of course everything that happened I took really personally. When you break a leg, you feel some type of pain. You get injured, and then you heal. But some scars remain anyway, and the same works with the conflicts. When you are living during the most global conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it is kind of hard to predict what's going to happen next. But I know the one thing, that the scars will remain, and these scars will touch many people from both sides, many families from both countries. I am Russian, but my both grandmothers were Ukrainians. I know so many families whose relatives are now in Ukraine. I even know a story of a woman whose sons are in different armies right now. Now it feels like you cannot be Russian and Ukrainian family at once. Not anymore. You have to choose the side. And people from one family just start to hate each other because they're from different sides. Russian-Ukrainian families are divided because ones don't believe others and others don't want to listen to ones. They lose their connection. They lose people they love, physically and mentally. They're getting broken not only by death, but also by words. And it's the biggest problem. I feel it in my family too. My aunts and uncles are fighting. My grandparents and parents are fighting. I don't want to call anyone because I know what will happen. Once, my cousin sent in our family chat such a stupid message about what's happening now, so I could not stifle myself. I wanted to hate her. It doesn't matter now what you support or whom you believe or which side you chose. Everyone will lose in any way. People whose children are in armies, children whose parents are in armies, Russian people whose relatives are in Ukraine, and of course, much more than others, Ukrainians. Of course, all of it will end one day. However, we'll have to wait many years or even centuries to recover, to build a new connection between people, to realize that you lost your family. You lost people you loved at least once, just because one day you got up and everything changed, and you could not keep your family. What we can do now is only support each other, pray for each other, and not forget that your parents are still your parents and your children are still your children. By the way, citizens are not equal to the government. And I hope that following this way will help us to recover faster and to survive this life after conflict. Everyone should realize that your family is the only thing that you have. Don't give it up. Only in this case, the whole situation will shift. No matter what happens, we need each other. I'm talking to Russian-Ukrainian families who start to block each other on Instagram, insult, blame, hate each other. Remember that the biggest scar won't be on the politics or economics, but on the families.
Thank you very much, Angelina. That's a very powerful piece. It's really, really wonderful of you to share it with us. So we'll come back to some responses to that in a minute. But just before we do, we're going to go to one other piece in this session by Austėja from Lithuania. Now, Austėja has not been able to join us live, but I think, is it Lucy? Lady Lucy is going to just say a few words about the picture.
Sorry, Alice, it might be me again, actually.
Okay.
Sorry to disappoint. We'll come to Lucy in a little while, though. Yes, I have a few sentences, which are: the artwork shows a dead mother of someone and a living but psychologically damaged child. With this picture, I wanted to show everyone that war deprives us of the most beloved and vulnerable people, mothers and children. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Will. And there's something very, very similar there in that it's a different context, it's a different kind of set of images, but that really resonates with what Angelina has just been saying as well about what families lose and the impact on all generations. So in our first set of speeches and art, we heard from people within Ukraine looking at the war through their eyes and their experience, their lived experience day to day. And what we've now just seen is three people from different parts of the world looking at Ukraine from outside, but showing huge empathy, huge compassion. And it would be really great now to hear from the adult panelists again and just get their reflections on what we've seen and what we've heard. So I wonder if we can go to Marshall first and just hear some reflections from you, Marshall.
Thank you again to all the young people for their words and for these images that I feel, as I'm sure we all do, quite viscerally. And returning to the theme of time, and now I mentioned before also space and place, connecting that a little bit more directly than I did perhaps last time. In these most recent contributions we've just heard from, this time we're looking forward in time, but also from places of conflict to places beyond the conflict zone, right? South Korea, Russia, Lithuania. Angelina refers us directly to scars, but all of the young people have pointed to this in various ways. For many of us, at least where I am in Canada, far from the conflict zone, the most visible scars are on the cityscapes. Right? This is what we see in a lot of the imagery that is presented, whether from satellites or from people on the ground. We know, of course, and we see some of it, the scars visit physically on human bodies. And we know too, because we hear the interviews and we intuitively know that there are scars on relationships and on people. But what these presentations, both this most recent group and the earlier ones that I'm now reflecting on a little bit differently in light of what we've just heard, remind us is that these are projected forward in time, and also to other places where conflict is as yet unknown and where we need to be vigilant about its emergence. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, but thank you all for giving me so much more to think about again.
Thank you, Marshall. And as you say, shining a light on some of the less visible scars and on just how long those scars may last. Can we go to Sean next and just hear from you?
Hello again. So once again, very powerful images, and I have many friends in Ukraine and colleagues, of course, and like Angelina said, many of them have relatives who are both Russian and Ukrainian in their families. So you hear this, I think a lot of what Angelina was saying a lot, and people being compelled to take sides, as I think she reflected in her piece. And this, but what I do see, I think, and feeding into this is the kind of almost, what we hear about the end of truth. I mean, I think in conflict there's always narratives and, different interpretations of events and so on and so forth. But it does feel very different this time in terms of the way the conflict is portrayed and the impact on the population. But I'm impressed with the Ukrainians I speak to who don't blame the Russian people as such. Some, yes, of course, where they're taking sides, where they're supporting the Kremlin's line on this conflict and taking arms against Ukrainians. But for the population as a whole, for many Russians, they don't actually blame them, and you hear them talking with a degree of hope. And that's inspiring. I find that really, really inspiring, because that must be a really difficult thing to do when you're friends and relatives. I mean, I've heard people talk about how they're relatives and they're not speaking to them anymore because they're telling them it's all Ukrainians' fault and so on and so forth. So, it's these narratives that are being established which are just not rooted in the reality that's going on the ground in Ukraine, that we hear from a lot of Russians. So again, I found her piece particularly inspiring with her willingness to listen to Russians and to give them the benefit of the doubt to some extent, and that's impressive.
Thanks, Sean. And I think one thing that struck me about Angelina's speech was this sense that this has happened to people, that one day you got up and everything changed and you couldn't keep your family, and this sort of the violence that's being inflicted on families, on all in Ukraine and beyond. Helen, I wonder if we can come to you next and just hear some thoughts from you.
Excellent. Absolutely. And once again, thank you to all the young people who shared in that session as well. I was really struck by all the pieces, but particularly Angelina's, in reminding us how local conflict is. I think there's a real tendency, and this goes to Marshall's comments of, similarly, I'm in Australia, I'm a long way from the site of this conflict physically, and a lot of what we see in news reports is, as Marshall said, of buildings and places or men in suits talking at microphones. And I think we start thinking about kind of the geopolitics and the strategic whatever of conflict, and we can lose sight sometimes of the fact that conflict is incredibly, exceptionally, always unescapably local and in people's daily lives and experiences, and that at the end of the day it's families who are living through this and who are experiencing these things. And I think Angelina's piece really clearly shows us how that can be really challenging to families who can find themselves on different sides of a conflict or in different places in a conflict. But I also think that the final piece shows us the kind of damage that can be done to families in losing parents, in losing friends, so that these are real consequences that are experienced in war. And I think in thinking about these things also, we can think about, to return to Marshall's comments, as in particular from the first discussion, about how we can see young people and their inclusion and their participation, because young people often don't get the microphone in the fancy rooms and press conferences, but that doesn't mean their experience and expertise can't tell us something unique about the conflicts and about the efforts to resist, about efforts to build peace, about efforts to survive, about efforts to continue to live a life with their siblings and their families amongst conflict as well. And I was really struck by Olivia's piece that started us off to say that we can't pretend that we are after conflict ever. And I think that this also goes to thinking back to the time question, but also about families and how these kinds of things really change us as we experience them. And just thanks once again to all the young people for making that really, really visible in these pieces.
Thank you, Helen. And that point about young people not having the microphone, but having such insights to share, and the way in which, in Angelina's piece, for example, the conflict plays out in a WhatsApp chat. It's not the kind of comment you hear in front of the cameras when people in seats are speaking, but it's a very real aspect of conflict. Now, General Tom, we're going to come to you in a second, but I understand that Olivia is in fact now on the call. And so, Olivia, would you like to talk us through your Molotov cocktail for peace? If not, we might go to Tom next, and Olivia, if you can keep trying, I'll try again with you in a second. Able to say a few words about the pieces that we've seen.
Thanks, Alice. There are so many things I'm tempted to say about these incredibly moving pieces. And the first, I can't really put into words. The first set of pictures were moving left to right on the paper and moving on the horizontal. The only phrase I can think of with these two pictures is a world turned upside down. So there's a much more vertical movement up and down. And the Baobab image sort of stuck in my mind.
Oh, it looks like we might have lost connection.
What's hidden below? I'll just pause. Can you hear me, Alice?
We can. You were breaking up slightly, but I can hear you again now.
Kind of what we see on the top, the scar, and then the unseen dash that's beneath the scar, or some of the scars that aren't even visible because they're mental. So that's what was going through my mind from Olivia's incredible picture, and also inevitably that idea of fire and flame and spirit, and in that case the spirit of resistance, and then that idea of a world turned upside down with Angelina. It was really that idea that mostly families fight because of trivial things that seem huge to us inside a family, but the rest of the world looking in can't understand why the family's getting excited. But here in a world and the families fighting about massive events that are going on outside the family, but because words have become twisted, the family falls out because of them. And the way that power corrupts words, the way that power hides the truth beneath the surface, can penetrate even the tightest of families and break them apart. So it's really that sense of the world upside down and where words, which should be the things that bring us together and connect us, actually words can become the things that break us apart and destroy us. And then, I mean, Alstige's incredibly moving picture, all I could think of there was a childhood robbed and somebody being brought to adulthood way earlier than they needed to. And it's such a powerful picture, because there you have innocence and youth, and at the same stage, you know, that 1,000-yard stare that we talk about, that comes from dreadful experiences. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, absolutely. There is so much emotion in that picture by Astea, and I'm really glad you brought out the many different bits of imagery in Olivia's picture. And as you say, these really do all speak to a sense of a world turned upside down. Olivia, are you having any more luck unmuting and being able to speak? It doesn't seem like you are at the moment. So what I think we'll do is we will hear from some other young people and then come back to you and hope that maybe we're able to fix things a little bit behind the scenes. We've got a great tech guy, Robbie, who might be able to send you a message offline and perhaps give you some advice about how to get this glitch sorted. But Olivia, it's wonderful to be able to see your art, and we very much hope we're going to be able to hear from you directly soon. And thank you also to Angelina and to Astea, who's on the call, I think, but not able to speak, for your very powerful words and artwork as well. What we're going to do now is move on to a third set of people. And again, just a reminder to anyone listening that you are welcome to put comments and questions in the Q&A as we go. I want to go next to Rena from Canada, who has painted a picture called Inexpressible Grief. Rena, are you able to talk us through that?
Yes, so I think I prepared a new speech, like a sort of a talk, just to say other things about my artwork. So I am Rena, or you can call me Rong. I am 13 years old and I am from Canada. My artwork is about a young kid that enduring the Ukraine and Russian war. And I created this artwork because I want to bring attention to this worldwide injustice that has displaced millions of people. For those who thought Russia invaded Ukraine due to a legitimate reason, I want to use this orphan kid in my art to show these heartless people what an evil regime they actually supported and what has the war actually done to people in Russia and Ukraine. Kids are forced out of their homes, people are hurt, and millions are running away from their home country because it's inhabitable. And as an immigrant, I understand the challenges to start a new life in a foreign country. In this new environment, the refugees have a new language to learn, a new school to go to, and to find a new different job. So compared to an immigrant, I believe the refugees' life are far more challenging, who have much less time to prepare for what will happen in a foreign country, and they probably didn't know where they can go and what to expect. And these differences make everything far more demanding. Moreover, in my art, the white peace sign means peace to everyone in the world. We need to look beyond Ukraine war and think about every war that's happening on the planet now. And I think from a young perspective, I don't understand the logic of war and why do humans kill each other. But at the end of the day, we're the same species with wisdom, and we could talk and we could understand each other, and most important of all, we could emphasize each other. We're not fighting in alien creatures who doesn't have language or intelligence. And any war on Earth, no matter what country they're fighting for, is really like a civil war between humans. Maybe I am a bit naive and idealistic, but I hope that the ultimate day can come soon where there might be no war between humans.
Thank you, Rena, for such powerful words. I'm sure our panelists will respond to those. Really, thank you very much for sharing those thoughts. And connecting that to your own migrant experience as well, and really reflecting and broadening out the discussion as well. Thank you, Rina. So next we will go to Yanjun from China. This is where music comes back in. Yanjun, are you able to talk us through your piece?
Hello, yes. I've slightly modified my speech. Hello, I'm Yanjun Mao from China. In February 2022, many ordinary people's homes were destroyed in Ukraine. I saw a large number of Ukrainian refugees fleeing in the news. One refugee was carrying a guitar, which left a deep impression on me. That is also where I got inspiration for the artwork. As depicted in my painting, the father and son are sitting in front of the ruin of their home. The father is playing his beloved flute to comfort the injured child. The father was completely devoted to music. These traumatizing events are unfortunately happening to countless people currently in Ukraine. These events happen in an instant, but it takes a long time for people to accept the truth. After the war, restoring normal life is not only requiring rebuilding homes, but also requires people to gradually come out of their grief. This is a slow and painful process. A father's music can't make a child's wound heal right away, both physically and mentally. But it helps. During the war and conflict, people tend to show their best, showing the best in human camaraderie through music. The flowing melodies of music can always help oneself express those unspeakable sorrows.
Thank you very much, Anjun, and a wonderful piece of artwork there, capturing some really, really important truths about the need for healing, the power of certain things to help with that healing, and really getting us thinking, as Tom alluded to earlier, about the art forms that we might reach to that cut through conflict. Last but not least, work by Namada from Sri Lanka has yet made it onto the call. I have a feeling that she hasn't, but Namada, if you're there, we'd love to hear from you.
Sorry, I've had some trouble unmuting. No, I don't believe she is, as far as I can tell, unfortunately. But yes, this piece has a wonderfully kind of simple description alongside it, which you can see here. During the war, a child has hope of a better future. She tries to take her country's flag out of the ruins to wave it proudly to show how much she loves her country.
Thanks, Will. And yeah, it's that spot of brightness in the centre of the picture there, which is very powerful, and again speaks to a future, speaks to a hope, and speaks to the resilience of a young person. So 3 more very powerful, very moving pieces of art there, capturing different aspects of the conflict in Ukraine, again from perspectives. Marshall, I wonder if we can come to you first, just to hear your thoughts on these 3 pieces of art. I think there are muting problems again. Are you managing to hit that button? If not, shall we go to Helen next, and hopefully Marshall will have unlocked his microphone in a few minutes. Helen, are you able to respond?
Yes, hopefully my unmute has worked. Excellent. The challenges of technology, but also the benefits that can bring us all together today as well, despite the difficulties. Once again, just thank you to the artists for sharing their work for this as well. I was really thinking through these pieces and echoes of the previous conversations as well about the intergenerational impacts of war that are evident in these. So we talked a little bit about family and the impacts on family, but I think these images can really show us is both what we know about war, that there are intergenerational impacts, that these things carry on through generations and in time we keep returning to, and that they're challenging and that they're protracted, and they're difficult things to solve in terms of addressing conflict as it's happening and in terms of rebuilding after conflict. And I was really struck by Young Jun's comment about needing to rebuild people as well. I was thinking about how several really emphasize the role that adults can play in supporting young people and enabling young people to contribute to these kinds of efforts as well. And one of the things that I know from research and from my own work, not in Ukraine but elsewhere, that young people say that they feel like they can actually make a difference more when adults validate and recognize the things that they are doing. So that one of the big issues that young people often face in this space is being made to feel like they can't talk, or being made to share that their contributions aren't worthy or aren't worth as much as adults talking. And that one of the things adults can really do and see what young people are saying as meaningful and important. And I think, in this session here today, we can see why, if we stop and take the time to actually are saying about these situations, about contemporary complex conflict, we can see what it can offer us in helping us better understand, not minimizing the impacts, both like now to families and going to address them and resolve them as well.
Thanks, Helen. And you used the word complex there. And of course, these are very complex issues. And I think I'm struck by how many different angles these 10 people, including Artem so far, have approached aspects of conflict from. And Rena, in her speech, said at one point, maybe I'm being naive. And actually, I was thinking, Rena, you were being far from naive. You were really cutting through issues, complex issues, with so much insight. And so, I hope you can hear us loud and clear when we're insightful and is very informed. I think that's one of the really striking things about all of the submissions that come into Never Such Innocence, that absolutely teach us about conflicts we've not really understood before, or maybe not been familiar with, or just show us new perspectives on conflicts that we think we already know. To General Tom next, because I think Teams keeps chucking Marshall out of the hopefully he will reconnect. But General Tom, can we hear from you next?
Thanks, Lisa. And I mean, just the way you created these, I found all of these hopeful. And I'll come to wrongs in particular, inexpressible grief, but I found all of them hopeful. Of course, Narmadas, and that the use of colour in all of them, and clearly the Ukrainian flag. And everybody's experienced conflict of any sort knows that everything greys out for a while in the crisis, and you don't see colour. And the colours of war are mud and concrete and grey and brown. And so just the use of colour here was incredibly strong, I felt, in all of them. And in Yanjan's picture here, I love the way bring that depth to the picture, but also the sort of unspoken guitar in the boy's hands that's a crutch, and that sense of, the guitar rather than a crutch. But I wanted to come back to wrongs in particular, because although on the one level it's a sort of horrifyingly dark picture, the reason I found light in it was because to dwell a little bit on the child, because I thought it just summed up everything about this webinar. Because you have here in the UK we call a pacifier a dummy, the thing to stop noise being made, and there you have a child who's visibly being stopped from their voice getting out, but at the same raised like a hand that says, I want to speak, raised like a hand that's also pointing to a brighter future, and all raised in almost a Winston Churchillian victory salute of a V for victory. And I just found that the most incredible. So I don't know whether I'm taking my cultural reference to your picture, but I don't know what of that was in your mind consciously. Incredibly powerful and an appropriate picture for today's webinar. So thank you, all of you, so much for those images.
Thanks, Tom. And I don't know if Ron wants to respond to that. How much power or powerlessness you see in the child in your picture. Do you have any reflections on that, Ron? If not, no worries. I put you on the spot there slightly. But if you want to say something about that later, pulled out that sort of mix of voicelessness and voice. Marshall, are you there? Are you able to comment? If not,
I did.
Oh, Marshall. Yes, you're here.
I think it's happened. So I'm sorry. Teams gives me a lot of trouble on my MacBook for some reason. So I'm not sure if I'll be repeating things that have been said, but because I've been in and out quite a bit here. Rena's artwork, Centering Childhood, expresses so much, right? I'm thinking loss, vulnerability, but also failures of responsibility. So that is the responsibility of the comparatively powerful to the vulnerable, but also the responsibility of some among the powerful for the violences visited on the vulnerable. It also, though, expresses in the background, but also in the futures signified in the figure of the child. Yanjun's artwork also expresses the same things, again in the figure of the child, but also in the as he put it, playing a part in bringing people out of their grief. And Namada's also points us to futures via hope itself, and once again in the figure of the child. All of these things, you know, it comes back to these futures, these temporalities. They all speak to the possibility of different futures, but all of them importantly turn on the possibility of relationships. So sorry, I wasted a lot of time trying to get it in and out. I'll leave it at that for now and hope I can speak again.
Thanks, Marshall. And I think you've drawn attention to a really interesting point there about the three we've just seen, that the first links very much back to our stayer's picture of a child who's dead body, and that sort of a child bereft of parental care, failure of responsibility, as you put it, from the adults around. And then we get this picture by Yanjun where there is actually parental responsibility, and then picture where the child themselves is starting to take ownership. And as you say, there's in all of these pictures, there's this mix and hurt, loss, and resilience and hope for the future. Sean, do you want to come in with any reflections?
Thank you, Alice. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. It's still saying I'm muted. Yeah, I think building, just kind of reflecting a bit on what both Marshall and Tom and yourself, actually, Alice, have said. I mean, these images here in particular made me think about, to some extent, hope, but also the huge challenges we say that Ukraine faces in the future. You know, as was mentioned, almost 13 million people displaced. And, you know, close to 8 million of those internally displaced. You know, obviously this is an area I specialise in, and the challenges in finding durable solutions for these people if and when they return. And most Ukrainians you speak to do intend to return when it's safe to do so. So, for example, the image, the picture by Yanjun with the crutch there made me think about the enormous number of landmines on an exploded ordnance that's now in Ukraine, which is going to be a huge challenge to clear up, and it particularly affects children and young people, often because they're attracted by shiny objects. You know, we do know that they are particularly affected by these by landmines and so on and so forth, especially young children. So yes, some hope, but also it did make me think about the huge challenges, and Ukraine's not going to be able to do this on its own. It's going to need a huge amount of international support, and I just hope that continues, because it will take many, many years to recover once this war is finally, this terrible war is finally over. Yeah.
Thanks, Sean. And as you've just indicated there, these pictures, you know, we can respond to them in their own right, but they also get us thinking about all sorts of repercussions and all sorts of other important issues. I want now just to give Olivia another chance, if she can, to join and share any comments she wants to make about her picture, Molotov cocktail. Olivia, are you able to unmute at this point and share anything? And while Olivia is trying, I just like the other young people who've spoken already, just to think about whether there's anything else that they would like to share now, having seen each other's work, heard each other's work. And in particular, I think the question I'd like to put to you all, if you've got any views on it, is why you think why you think adults really can benefit, how you think adults can benefit from listening to young people's voices on conflict. So Olivia, are you managing to unmute? If not, no worries. It doesn't seem so. In which case, Sasha, Jana, Angelina, Rina, and Yanjun, do you have any other things that any of you would like to say? And if you do, just unmute and share any thoughts you have on why it's important to hear young people's voices on conflict.
I feel like that it's sort of important to just listen to young people, because I think they just have a younger mindset, and maybe when you understand them, you can sort of see when they grow up how will the world change. Like there might be less racial inequality, gender inequality, and a more open-minded world, inclusive world, I guess.
Thank you, Rina. That open-mindedness and that young mindset as having huge value and you know, an expertise in its own right. Yanjun, do you have any other views that you'd like to share?
Not really.
Not really. That's absolutely fine. If anyone else, if any other young people would like to chip in, go for it. Angelina and Jana and Sasha, if you do, just chip in. But in the meantime, Will, I wonder if you could identify if there are questions from attendees that people would like to put either to our adult panelists or to young people.
Yes, thank you, Alice. We have a question from Dr. Roddy Brett, who says, hi, thanks to all the young artists and contributors and the panel. Children are the experts on their experiences in war and have essential contributions to make to the shape/content of peace building. There have been convincing and urgently justified demands to include local actors, women, victims and other groups in peacemaking and peace building. I've been working with colleagues at University of Bristol to explore where the equivalent voices urging policymakers to include children in these processes are. Please can the panel share any thoughts on this constant exclusion of children and suggest any reference around this theme? Thank you.
And I think we might go to Helen on that, if that's okay, first of all. Helen, can you respond to Roddy on that one?
Yes. Yes, hopefully I'm unmuted. Thank you, Roddy, for the question. I think it's incredibly important, and I think you've highlighted a really important issue that is worthy of discussion. From a, I guess, the frameworks that kind of guide interventions and the way that we engage in peace building and the way we think about these kind of things. One of the things that obviously tells us young people should participate is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that says children have a right to participate and have a right to be heard on issues that affect their life. And yet one of the things that we see happen quite often in contexts of conflict and peace building, which I'm sure you're familiar with in the work you're doing as well, is that the protection framework comes in as kind of the overriding issue for children in conflict. And that is not to say that protection is not incredibly important in conflict for everyone, but particularly children who, for a whole range of reasons, have less power and less resources to respond to conflict. But I think it often means that we lose sight of the importance of children's participation in these spaces as well. And you're absolutely right that they've been very convincing and justified, I think you said, calls to include other kinds of groups. And Alice mentioned before this increasing attention on youth inclusion and youth peace and security, but that often doesn't include children, the older age, and we're talking about assumptions about competency and assumptions about expertise and knowledge and being able to participate, and children are just not seen as having it. I think that in particular efforts in particular areas, there are actors who are working against this. So we're talking about biases and systemic kind of structures and the way things are done, but that isn't to say that there aren't people within a whole lot of organisations that are working very hard to make spaces for children to participate and to be included. And I think that there absolutely needs to be continued push on this. I think that the space that has been opened up by these very convincing claims to include women, to include youth, to include other kinds of actors, gives us that space to keep pushing exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, and that many of the young people in this call are demonstrating as well, that there is space and should be space for children as well. So yes, important, and I think push more on it.
Thanks very much, Helen. I know in your work, and also Marshall in his work, have been looking really hard at the sort of the ingrained assumptions that we have about children, what Marshall sometimes talks about as the imagined childhood. I know other people have written about that too, and this idea that children are vulnerable and need of protection and not expert. And of course, some of those things are true, and yet they are also not true as well, in that we've got to balance this vulnerability and this need of protection with an awareness of the expertise and the competence. And Helen, you've talked and written a lot about that yourself. Will, is there another question from the audience?
Sorry, I'm Mike there again. Yes, we had a rather long question from Paul. It's kind of in two parts. I may be able to answer the second. But Paul asks or suggests many of the images here employ conventional techniques or tropes for representing war, such as then and now pairing of dead and living trees, presented by the first artist, or the graphic novel-like densely filled page of Olivia. I wonder if the panelists are surprised not to see more direct imitations of the way images of the war appear on social media, with hashtags, textual overlays, artistic filters, and so on. And then the second part of the question, were the images presented here selected because they better fit the standards of traditional representations of war, or are they indeed representative of the images children are creating today? So that second part, as someone who's helped in the kind of the selection process, I can safely say we've seen work from a whole range of different countries, and we've aimed to showcase it and platform it in the way we've received it. We're not here to determine what has more artistic value, whether it's a painting or a sketch or whatever else you may have seen on your screen today. I think, yes, some of the pieces, they may employ some conventional techniques, but I think they do way more than just that. I think they build on them considerably and create something entirely particular, specific to this time and place as well. So I'll leave it there because I'm not here to speak too much. But that's the second part of the question. The first part, yes, asks, I wonder if the panelists are surprised not to see more direct imitations of the way images of the war appear on social media, with hashtags, textual overlays, artistic filters, and so on. So I'll hand over to you, Alice.
Thanks very much, Will. And it's a really interesting point that when people want to express themselves, that often actually people do go back to one of the oldest media around, the media of painting or the media of drawing. For all that we have all sorts of digital media available. I wonder if Tom or Marshall have any thoughts on that. Were you yourselves expecting different kind of art from the digital generation? Were you surprised by what you've seen and what you've heard today, or not at all surprised? Should we go to Tom first?
Hello.
Thanks for the question, Paul. I'm not surprised because I wasn't quite sure initially what to expect. I mean, if I was to think on the way Paul's put the question, I suppose philosophically you might question whether the digital generation that has grown up doesn't trust what comes through in digital form in the same way as we, who might sanctify the written word a little bit more from our own upbringing. Clearly, I don't know what generation Paul comes from, but I wonder if that's a bit of it, that we're so bombarded by digital imagery now, much of it really shocking and horrible in a way that is never really, we talked about Vietnam, I think, as the first television war, and then you had the Falklands, both, through my childhood, those were immensely impactful. But we've seen different levels of horror and reality beam straight into us. And I think, as you said, Alice, I think sometimes we then want to abstract that into more traditional art forms because it helps us process what we're doing. And the shockingness of Russia's activity in Ukraine, I think, has taken the breath out of many of our lungs just because we thought we were beyond that. So I think it would be understandable if we all, are almost worn out by the digital imagery we've seen and do revert back to more traditional forms of art to give us a bit of distance from it, because we're trying to process just how ghastly this behaviour is and try to make sense of it. I think that's a very human reaction, but I'm sorry if that's not a more thought through response, but that's that's why I take it.
Oh, I think you've made some really important points there, Tom. And I'm struck that actually in these speeches by Jana, by Sasha, and others, that there is a reaching back into a time long ago, World War II, 75 years of history and so on. And so maybe there is a reaching back to older art forms that transcend the current moment. I am struck, and Yanjun might want to say something about this, that Yanjun, when he was talking about his painting, his very beautiful father and son, Yanjun, you said you were inspired initially by something you saw on social media, by an image, photograph of someone leaving Ukraine, leaving the ruins of their home behind with their guitar. But it's interesting that you've then gone not to a sort of a digitalized form of art, but to drawing and color work, to transpose that into something more universal, I suppose, something that's not time bound in the 21st century. Yanjun, if you want to come in on that, do. Olivia, I just wondered whether we had heard Olivia briefly then.
I think I have access.
Fantastic. Olivia, we can hear from you. So I'm going to take us back to your picture. Olivia, just talk us through it.
Thank you. Hello, I am a 14-year-old girl who loves art and reading, like so many others around the world. In Ukraine too, but another 14-year-old girl living in Ukraine is living a life nothing like mine. The only difference is where we live. Your location should not be the deciding factor whether you live in peace or war. I've been taught since a young age that peace is one of the things that is supposed to be guaranteed from your birth. But I've learned that this is not the truth. I've followed the war through the news on the screen, and even from the beginning I was sure that this is going to leave me heartbroken, and it did. But one of the things that surprised me most when doing this research was that just as much as this disaster was categorized by tragedy, it too also was categorized with stories of Ukrainian bravery who filled the news. And we've seen 3 of these young heroes today. And I realized hope too was universal.
I was moved by the events happening abroad and showed my hope through this painting of a Molotov cocktail. I believe that this is a symbol for this conflict. I was inspired by news stories and photos of Ukrainians who were fighting tanks with Molotov cocktails. And watching these news stories, I thought that if heroes and stories really existed, this is what they must be like. People who fight to protect what they believe in, even when the fight is not in their favor. I wanted to capture this fervor and spirit of these heroes in my piece. Molotov cocktail burns as bright and as furious as the fuel in the bottle. And if the fuel were the disasters and the tragedies, then hope was the spark. I wanted to capture this idea. And I thought this is what life after conflict really is. And as someone who lives in a country who remains in ceasefire, I know this is true, because I too had nightmares as a child that my country will be invaded one day, and I too will have everything taken away from me in a flash. My own father will be ripped away from me in conscription. But what is currently happening right now in Ukraine is worse than my greatest nightmares. And all my hopes and thoughts are for the people who are fighting in the front lines, in the back, helping people, and people like us, the people who spoke today. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. And I'm so glad you were able to join us because what you've just said is so powerful and so moving. I'm really struck actually by the fact that you started off with this understanding that young people, everyone, have rights, something that Helen's referred to a little bit. It's this awareness of your rights. And this sense of universal connection and this ability to empathize from your situation and to admire and respect and stand in solidarity with people whose reality is so different from yours. But as you say, it's about where we are in place and time that sometimes throws us into these situations. Marshall, did you manage to hear Olivia there?
Yes, I did. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'd like to draw what Olivia just shared together with a bunch of threads. The kind of creative engagement that she has had with her own circumstance and with the circumstances of others, and then expressing it as well through this artwork. A couple of the threads I'd like to draw in are the observation that we see a lot of sometimes familiar tropes in the visual art, in the written and spoken word, but that also there is this intervention, right, by these young people, that they are creatively going beyond, they're building on that. And I think if we bring this back to the idea of imagined childhood, it gives us some sense of what it is that we're missing out on when we let that dominant idea of children as not yet capable, not yet competent, get in our way. And if I can just quickly use the metaphor of the teacher and the student, and that often maps with the adult and the child. The teacher brings expertise, but another way to look at expertise is habits of thought. The child, the student, doesn't join that encounter with the same level of experience, the same expertise, but they have the creative insight to ask the why questions, where the teacher has already been socialized into knowing that that sounds heretical or outlandish or what have you. And so we can reproduce knowledge when we only ever listen to the adults. We can never produce new knowledge without engaging those new voices. People under 14 are a quarter of the world's population. Under 18, they are a third. We are getting better, though, have a long way to go in recognizing how gender or race, how these exclusions operate problematically. Childhood still resides in the realm of common senses, and we've got to get past that.
Thank you so much, Marshall. Those are such important points. As you say, the word intervention is a really valuable thing to hold on to. All of these pieces of art, these speeches are very, very powerful interventions. And that analogy of the teacher and the child and the habits of thought versus the questions, the why, the new knowledge, the disruption to habits of thought. That's absolutely what the Never Such Innocence project is all about. And it's very much what the Visualising War project is all about, really studying the forces that shape our habits of visualizing war and peace, but also the impact that young people can have in shaking them up and moving them on. We are coming to the end of our time, I'm afraid. It's been a very packed webinar, and I'm really grateful to absolutely everyone who's shared, who's participated. I wish we could have heard more from you. I want to say that this is very much the start of a project which Never Such Innocence is running, of conversations on conflict with young people, bringing young people from all around the world into dialogue. And I want to end by inviting Lady Lucy French to read one final poem by Natasha from the UK, with a final set of final young person's reflections on the war in Ukraine. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you so much. Before I read this wonderful poem, I'd like to say how moved and impressed I've been by all of the young people that have had great courage to share their thoughts and their reflections. And I feel, for me, having run Never Such Innocence for a long time now, to have this platform for these young people with all of our panelists makes an enormous difference. And I feel very much that if all of you young people were in charge of the world today, we'd be in a very good place. So I thank you for your courage and your solidarity for our young friends in Ukraine. So you've all done such a wonderful thing today. I'm going to end with this poem. It is called Ukraine. Sunflowers sprout onwards, upwards seeking sunlight. Roars of resistance, pride, power to the people. Blue, yellow, yellow, blue. Respect for the nation that fights for their hearts, their minds, their loves. For your freedom and ours. Rebuild, recover, remember the dignity, the pride we fought so hard to keep. Stay strong, fight on. Trills of the nightingale eternally sound, echoing around our world, lamenting for the justice of Slava Ukraini. Thank you. I mean, I think Natasha's poem really does sum up the feeling of people around the world.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for reading that, Lucy. And thank you for starting the idea for this webinar. As you've said, thank you so much to the young people who've shared their poems, their speeches, their artwork, who've had the bravery to come and speak and to join in dialogue with each other. And thank you also to our 4 adult panelists for your really warm and really insightful reflections on the material that we've been looking at and listening to today. This conversation could go on, and I very much hope it will. I would echo what Lucy's just said, which is that the insights that we've seen from young people, the hope, the critical reflection, the criticism of adult choices, the identification of failures of responsibility, failures of decision making, all of that is incredibly important to listen to. And if we do, we are going to be heading towards a brighter world and a better future. I will let everyone get on with the rest of their day now, but just thanks again to everyone for attending and to everyone who's been part of this. Very much thanks to Will as well for all his hard work behind the scenes, and to Robbie for sorting all the IT out, even though Teams wasn't at its best today, I would say. But thank you, and please do stay in touch with the Visualising War project and with Never Such Innocence, and we'll keep you posted on future events. Thank you.